You mentioned how so much of our self-worth is based on the assessment that others seem to make or our perception of how others perceive us. And so much of
Hmm.
that takes place now, whether it's in school, we grow up believing a certain view of ourselves, and that gets amplified whenever we join a workforce. And if we end up
Hmm.
working for an employer that's a very large corporate company, they tend to have policies that demoralize and look at
Hmm.
people as parts of a machine that tend to remove all facets of what it means to be human when you have these people working for you.
Yes. The first two chapters of the book are really locating what's happening today in the workplace in the context of neoliberalism, which is basically a way of organizing our society that became dominant since Reagan came to power in the early 1980s. And the idea is to subordinate all dimensions of social life to profit maximization. And with it, you saw the diffusion of ways of understanding collectively who's a worthy person that is even more directly connected to productivity and to higher education and to our ability to consume. So that's in the book, I describe this as a kind of hegemony or the dominance of the upper middle class. Only people who are college educated and who are professionals and managers come to be viewed as worthy. And the people who don't have this, the people who are not college educated, the blue collar workers, have experienced progressively over the last 40 years of feeling that they really don't matter. While in fact, they're essential workers, they make our society work. That during the pandemic, of course, there's a moment where we really celebrated essential workers. But overall, the message that they get all the time is that they're not that important. And there are studies, content analysis of entertainment television that shows that they are very rarely represented in the shows. And when they are represented, they're often viewed as buffoons or fools or, lazy people. So there's a real issue with trying to diffuse a more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy. And that's one of the argument of the book. What can we do to make sure that the largest number of, members of our society are perceived as worthy people? Well, it's by promoting a more pluralistic understanding of who's worthy and to disconnect to a greater extent than we are doing now the notion of who's worthy through how much education we have, how competitive we are, and how much we can consume. So really, for the upper middle class, people like me who are highly educated, often the question of how worthy you are is tied to your consumption, what kind of car you can buy, how much money you bring home. And this confusion between status and worth is very common among people who are in the upper middle class. But for people who don't have a college degree, their conception of their own worth is quite separate from their conception of their social status. They may have low social status, but they might think they're very worthy because they view themselves as people who stand by their friends, even when their friends are in trouble, who try to be good parents, even if they don't have the resources they need to give their kids everything they would want to give them, that they are good human beings. That's also present too in the upper middle class, but the fact that they have high status tends to overshadow how they think about who's worthy. And that's complicated because it also leads many people to think less highly of those who don't make much money. The US is a country where low income people are deeply stigmatized. They're viewed as unworthy because many people think they're poor because they're lazy or because they're stupid. Well, this is not universal. There are countries where the poor are far less stigmatized than they are in the US. So we need to do more work to. The argument of the book is really that we need to think about how to provide people alternative stories of narratives about who low income people are and why they are where they are. So there's a lot of efforts that are being made in the cultural sphere to try to diffuse alternative narratives. So one example I would give is the film Roma, which won an Oscar. It was a film that came out in 2019, I think, that represented the life of two women who are domestic workers in Mexico City. They work for a middle class family. And the film is really centered on them, not on the family. And one of them needs an abortion. So you follow the moral dilemmas that she's facing in having an abortion. And it really makes visible this group of domestic workers that are typically totally invisible or presented in a unidimensional way and it makes you understand their life condition. And that film was produced in part with the support of the Ford Foundation, which is one of the largest foundation in the US. And they worked together with the Alliance of Domestic Workers, which is a union of domestic workers, a group that is not unionized typically and that works under really challenging conditions. Many of them are underpaid and they are undocumented. So the Ford Foundation is among other foundations that really put a lot of money toward transforming how Americans think about poverty so that most people become better informed about the structural challenges that low-income people face so that they're not only stigmatized because they're blamed for being poor due to their moral weaknesses, but that we understand better how the conditions under which they live makes it extremely difficult for people to be upwardly mobile. So that's an example. So in other words, the solution I promote in the book are not only about mental health and well-being, it's really about how can we transform our society in such a way that we can transform the perception that we have of groups that are deeply stigmatized, and how this can be achieved. Not mindfulness for me is not the solution. For me, the solution is really to transform the narratives, the stories to which we have access to concerning various groups, whether it is low-income people or people with HIV/AIDS or obese, which is also a deeply stigmatized group, people who live with obesity. So it's a story about the transformation of society by transforming the narratives that are made available to people.